The stagecoach lurched to a halt, and Eleanor Bell gripped the leather strap until her knuckles went white. Through the dust-caked window, she glimpsed San Dismas, a collection of weathered buildings huddled against the New Mexico wind like cattle before a storm. The driver's gruff voice cut through the howling gale. "End of the line, ma'am." Eleanor gathered her traveling dress, careful to keep the hem from dragging in the red dust that seemed to coat everything in this forsaken place. Her silver hair, once a rich chestnut, caught the late afternoon sun as she descended. The wind immediately claimed her dignity, whipping her careful bun into wild strands that danced around her face like accusing fingers. "You, the schoolmarm." The driver squinted at her, tobacco juice staining the corner of his mouth. "I'm expected." Eleanor replied, neither confirming nor denying. Let him think what he would. Soon enough, the whole town would know why Eleanor Nora Bell had traveled 800 miles to this dusty corner of civilization. The main street stretched before her, a river of dirt flanked by false-fronted buildings that promised more than they delivered. Hetty's boarding house squatted at the far end, its painted sign swinging on rusty chains. Eleanor had memorized every word of Tobias Kincaid's letters, including his promise to meet her there at 4 o'clock sharp. She was 17 minutes early. The boarding house parlor smelled of lye soap and disappointment. Hetty Burns herself presided over the establishment like a crow over carrion, her sharp eyes missing nothing as Eleanor entered. "You must be the bride," Hetty announced, loud enough for the handful of patrons to hear. "Tobias said to expect you, though I'll say you're not quite what any of us pictured." Eleanor's spine stiffened, but she kept her voice steady. "Mrs. Eleanor Bell, I trust Mr. Kincaid left word about a room." "Oh, he left word all right." Hetty's laugh had edges sharp enough to draw blood. "Said he'd be taking care of all the arrangements himself. Man's been pacing like a caged cat all morning." A younger woman with sun-weathered skin and knowing eyes emerged from the kitchen, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. "I'm Rosita Santos," she said, her accent soft as worn leather. "You look like you could use some water." Eleanor accepted the glass gratefully, noting how Rosita's kindness seemed to irritate Hetty. The water tasted of minerals and distance, nothing like the sweet well water back home in Ohio. But then, nothing here would be like home. That was the point. The door banged open, admitting a blast of sand-laden air and a man who could only be Tobias Kincaid. Eleanor recognized him from the tintype he'd sent, the same narrow shoulders, the same eager merchant smile. What the photograph hadn't captured was how his eyes would change when they landed on her. The smile froze, then crumbled like adobe in rain. "You're Mrs. Bell." Eleanor rose, extending her hand. "Mr. Kincaid, how pleasant to finally meet you in person." He didn't take her hand. His gaze traveled from her silver hair to her lined face, to the motherly curve of her figure that no amount of clever dressmaking could disguise. The parlor had gone cemetery quiet. "But you said you were." He swallowed hard. "You're old." The word hung in the air like a hanged man. Eleanor's hand remained extended for another heartbeat before she lowered it. "I'm 46, Mr. Kincaid, as I stated in my third letter." 46. He repeated it like a curse. 46. Good God, woman. My mother's barely 50. Someone snickered, a rough-looking cowhand nursing whiskey in the corner. Eleanor didn't turn to look, but she felt eyes on her from every corner of the room. One pair seemed different from the rest, steady and unblinking, but she couldn't place their source. "Mr. Kincaid," Eleanor began, but he was already backing away. No, this won't do at all. I need a wife, not a grandmother. I've got a business to build, a legacy to establish. I need sons, strong sons. You're past all that. Anyone can see it." "Mr. Kincaid, the deal's off." His voice climbed higher with each word. You hear me off, I won't be saddled with some dried-up spinster who lied about her prospects." "I never lied." Eleanor's voice came out steady as bedrock, though something inside her trembled like a newborn calf. "Every word in my letters was true." "You let me believe. You made me think." He yanked a folded paper from his vest pocket, the marriage contract they'd signed by mail. With theatrical fury, he tore it in half, then quarters, then flung the pieces at her feet. "There, it's done. And that land deed that was meant as your bride gift, I've already signed it back over to Pike. Got a good price for it, too, enough to cover my troubles." Eleanor's breath caught. The land deed, but that was payment for my wasted time. Tobias was already heading for the door. "Find your own way back to wherever you came from. Old woman, San Dismas has no use for the likes of you." The door slammed behind him with finality. In the silence that followed, Eleanor became aware of every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of fabric as people shifted to get a better look at her humiliation. Hetty Burns broke the spell with a laugh sharp as shattered glass. "Well, that's that then. Hope you kept your return fare, Mrs. Bell. Stage comes back through on Thursday." Eleanor bent and gathered the torn pieces of the contract with methodical care, tucking them into her reticule. When she straightened, she found Sheriff Whit McKendry standing before her, his badge dulled by dust and compromise. "Ma'am," he said, not unkindly, "might be best if you moved along. San Dismas can be rough on a woman alone, especially one without connections." "I see." Eleanor met his gaze. "And the land, mister. Kincaid mentioned the deed that was to be part of our arrangement." Something flickered across the sheriff's weathered face. "That's between you and him, I reckon. Though if Ephraim Pike's already got his hands on it, well," he shrugged. "Mister, Pike tends to keep what he claims." "Ephraim Pike." Eleanor tested the name. "I don't believe Mister. Kincaid mentioned him in his letters." "No," the sheriff said slowly. "I don't suppose he would have." A chair scraped across the floor, and Eleanor finally identified the source of that steady gaze. A man unfolded from the shadows, tall, lean, weather-carved as a canyon wall. He wore his gun low and his hat lower, but something in his bearing suggested he'd be just as dangerous without either. He didn't speak, just dropped coins on the bar and moved toward the door with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to long hours in the saddle. As he passed Eleanor, he paused. For a moment, their eyes met hers, gray as morning fog, his dark as deep water. Then he touched his hat brim and was gone, leaving only the faint scent of leather and sage. "That's Caleb Rourke." Rosita murmured, "Don't pay him no mind. Man's got his own troubles." Eleanor turned back to find Hetty watching her with predatory interest. "Still planning to stay rooms $2 a night. Paid in advance. No credit for jilted brides." Eleanor opened her purse and laid out the coins. 3 nights, please." Hetty's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. "Suit yourself. Though I can't imagine what you think you'll accomplish in 3 days." Neither could Eleanor, but she'd come too far to turn back now. As she followed Hetty up the narrow stairs, she caught a glimpse of herself in a spotted mirror. Silver hair, lined face, the soft body of a woman who'd borne and buried 2 children before their time. Tobias Kincaid was right about one thing: she was no blushing bride. But she'd survived worse than the scorn of a shallow merchant in a dust-blown town. And that land, why had Kincaid been so quick to sell it back? What was Ephraim Pike's interest in a small parcel meant as a marriage gift? Thunder rumbled across the desert, and the first fat raindrops began to fall, turning the street below into a river of mud. Eleanor stood at her window and watched the town scramble for cover. In the distance, she spotted a lone rider, Caleb Rourke. She thought heading into the storm without hurry, as if he and the weather had an understanding. 3 days. She'd bought herself 3 days to understand why she'd been brought here. Because despite Tobias Kincaid's betrayal, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that Sandismus was exactly where she needed to be. The torn contract in her reticule crackled as she set down her bags. Tomorrow, she'd ask questions. Tonight, she'd allow herself to grieve not for Kincaid, who'd proved himself unworthy of tears, but for the hope that had carried her across half a continent. The hope that somewhere, someone might want an old bride after all. Outside, the storm gathered strength, and Sandismus prepared for another night of dust and dreams deferred. But in the morning, Eleanor Bell would still be here, silver hair and all, ready to discover what secrets lay beneath the town's sun-baked surface. After all, she'd come too far to be dismissed so easily, and perhaps, just perhaps, that steady-eyed cowboy wasn't the only one in Sandismus with troubles worth investigating. The kitchen of Hetty's boarding house was a dragon's mouth before dawn, all heat and smoke and the promise of being devoured. Eleanor tied her hair back with practiced efficiency and surveyed her new domain. The previous cook had fled in the night, leaving behind burnt pots and the lingering smell of failure. "You know your way around a stove." Hetty's skepticism could have curdled fresh milk. "I raised 2 children and kept house for 20 years, Eleanor replied, already calculating how to stretch the meager supplies. "I believe I can manage breakfast for 12 boarders." Hetty snorted. "We'll see. Breakfast is at 6 sharp. The men get ornery when it's late. And Mrs. Bell." She paused at the doorway. "I'm doing this against my better judgment. 1 complaint, and you're back on the street." Eleanor nodded and set to work. The kitchen fought her at every turn. The stove drew poorly. The flour had weevils, and the lard was rancid. But she'd made do with less. By the time the first boarders stumbled down, drawn by the smell of fresh biscuits, she had produced a minor miracle: flapjacks that didn't taste of soot, bacon that wasn't leather, and coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. Well, I'll be damned. The speaker was a grizzled miner missing 2 fingers. "Food that's actually fit to eat." Eleanor set a plate before him. "Language, Mr. Horace Greeley, ma'am. And begging your pardon." He tucked into his breakfast with enthusiasm. "Been months since we had decent grub." The kitchen door swung open, admitting Caleb Rourke. He moved with the same quiet purpose she'd noticed yesterday, settling at the corner table like smoke finding cracks. Eleanor brought him coffee without being asked black. No sugar. Something in his nod of thanks suggested she'd guessed right. "You're the bride," he said. It wasn't a question. "I was to be—" Eleanor kept her voice neutral. "Now I'm the cook." "Hetty treating you fair?" The question surprised her. "Fair enough." He studied her over the rim of his cup. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the kind carved by sun and sorrow in equal measure. "You planning on staying?" "For now." "Good." He set down exact change and rose. Town could use decent cooking. After he left, Eleanor found an extra $1 tucked under his plate. She stared at it, then quietly added it to her apron pocket. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. The morning rush ended, leaving her with mountains of dishes and aching feet. She was elbow-deep in suds when Rosita Santos appeared. "Let me see your hands." Eleanor started to protest, then saw the medical bag. She extended her hands, already raw from the lye soap. "Thought so?" Rosita produced a tin of salve that smelled of sage and something medicinal. "Hetty buys the cheapest soap. It'll eat through leather given time." "You're a doctor." Rosita's laugh was warm honey. "Midwife, herbalist, and the closest thing to a doctor this town has, unless you count Doc Pritchard, but he's drunk more often than not." She worked the salve into Eleanor's damaged skin with gentle efficiency. "Why did you stay?" Eleanor considered her answer. "Where else would I go?" "Back home. There's nothing there for me." The truth of it still stung. "My children are gone. My husband's been in the ground 5 years, and I sold everything to pay for this journey." Rosita's hands stilled.
"I'm sorry."
"Don't be. I made my choice." Eleanor flexed her fingers, already feeling relief. "Besides, I'm curious now. About the land, mister. Kincaid sold back so quickly, about why Mr. Pike wanted it. Curiosity can be dangerous in San Dismas. So can ignorance." A grin flashed across Rosita's face. "True enough. But if you're planning to dig into Pike's business, you'll need friends. Come to my place tonight after dinner service. I'll brew tea, and we can talk properly." The afternoon brought its own challenges. Eleanor discovered the pantry was nearly bare, and the credit at Holbrook's general store had been suspended. She was contemplating creative uses for cornmeal when a small figure darted through the kitchen door. The boy couldn't have been more than 10, all knees and elbows and dirty face. He clutched a gunny sack to his chest like treasure. "You the new cook?" "I am. And you are?" Sammy May." He thrust the sack at her. "Got rabbits, fresh caught. Trade you for food." Eleanor examined the rabbits cleanly taken, recently dressed. "These are fine rabbits. Sammy, where are your parents?" His face shuddered. "Don't got none, but I earn my way, fair and square." "I see." Eleanor made a decision. "How about this, you help me in the kitchen after school, and I'll make sure you get supper every night. And I'll buy your rabbits when you have them." Suspicion warred with hunger in his eyes. "What's the catch?" "You have to attend school regularly, and wash your hands before handling food." "That's it." "That's it." He thrust out a grimy hand to shake on it, then remembered the second condition and quickly spat on his palm to clean it. Eleanor bit back a smile and shook solemnly. The dinner preparation was interrupted by the sound of hammering from the stable. Eleanor found Caleb Rourke balanced on the roof, replacing boards that had rotted through. "Hetty hire you," she called up. He paused, silhouetted against the afternoon sky. "I owe her a debt. This is payment." "Must be some debt." "It is." He returned to his work, effectively ending the conversation. But when Eleanor brought him water an hour later, he accepted it with something that might have been a smile. "You always this persistent with your kindness. You always this determined to be mysterious." That earned her a real smile, quick as lightning and just as startling. "Fair point, Mrs. Bell." "Eleanor or Nora, if you prefer." "Nora." He tested the name. "It suits you." They worked in companionable silence, him hammering, her preparing vegetables for the evening stew. Sammy May proved surprisingly helpful, peeling potatoes with focused determination while regaling her with gossip. "That's Mr. Pike's warehouse," he said, pointing through the window at a squat building. "Got guards on it day and night. Tom Brennan said he saw them unloading barrels in the middle of the night last week." "Barrels of what?" Sammy shrugged. "Dunno, but Sarah's PA said he heard hammering inside, like they was building something." Eleanor filed the information away. After dinner, which was received with considerably more enthusiasm than breakfast, she made her way to Rosita's small adobe house on the Mexican side of town. The interior was a surprise. Herbs hung from every rafter, and shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of mysterious contents. It smelled of copal incense and comfort. "Sit," Rosita commanded, pressing a cup of tea into Eleanor's hands. "Now, tell me why you're really interested in that land." Eleanor took a sip chamomile with something else, something that eased the knots in her shoulders. When a man gives up a dowry that quickly, it suggests he got something better in return. And when someone like Pike is involved, you're sharper than you let on. Rosita settled across from her. "That land sits on the old Spanish grant boundary, supposed to have water rights attached, though nobody's seen water there in years." "Water rights." Eleanor turned the words over. "In a desert town, that would be valuable." "More than valuable. Pike controls most of the water in San Dismas, wells, the old acequia system, even rainwater collection. But there are old laws from when this was still Mexico. If someone could prove prior claim... They were interrupted by a soft knock. Rosita opened the door to reveal Sheriff McKendry, hat in hand. "Ladies, sorry to disturb, but there's been trouble at the boarding house." Eleanor was on her feet immediately. "What kind of trouble?" "Nothing serious, ma'am. Just thought you should know someone tried to break into the storage shed. Caleb Rourke caught him in the act." They returned to find a crowd gathered in front of Hetty's. At the center stood Caleb, his hand resting casually on his gun. Facing down, Blackjack Doyle. "Just checking on supplies for Mr. Pike," Doyle was saying. His smile had too many teeth and not enough warmth. "No harm meant." "Pike doesn't own this property," Caleb replied evenly. Yet. Doyle's eyes found Eleanor in the crowd. "Things change fast in San Dismas. Ask the old bride there." Eleanor felt every gaze turned to her, but she kept her chin high. "Mr. Doyle, if Mr. Pike needs supplies, I'm sure he can afford to purchase them during regular hours." Doyle's face darkened. "You'd best watch your tongue, woman. This ain't no place for Eastern sensibilities." "Enough." Sheriff McKendry stepped between them. "Move along. Doyle, no crime's been committed here." Doyle backed away, but his eyes never left Eleanor. "Be seeing you, Mrs. Bell." After the crowd dispersed, Eleanor found Caleb in the kitchen, calmly drinking coffee as if he hadn't just faced down Pike's most dangerous enforcer. "Thank you," she said. He shrugged. Man was sniffing around the wood bin. Notice there's new planks under the old ones. Someone's been storing more than kindling. Eleanor's pulse quickened. "What do you think they're storing?" "Don't know, but Pike doesn't send Blackjack Doyle for casual errands." He set down his cup. "You might want to consider that return ticket. Nora, this isn't your fight." "Isn't it?" She met his gaze steadily. "They took my land, destroyed my prospects, and now they're sneaking around in the night. I'd say they've made it my fight." Something shifted in his expression. Respect, perhaps, or recognition. "You're not what I expected from an Eastern schoolmarm." "I'm not a schoolmarm, and you're not just a drifting cowhand." "No," he admitted, "I'm not." They stood there, two people with secrets and scars, recognizing something familiar in each other. Then Sammy burst through the door. "A missus. Nora, come quick. There's water coming up through the floorboards in the cellar." They rushed down to find a steady seepage darkening the dirt floor. Caleb knelt, pressing his hand to the damp earth. "Underground stream," he said slowly. "Probably been diverted, but water finds its way." He looked up at Eleanor. "This boarding house sits on the old acequia route, the one that used to feed the land Kincaid sold." Eleanor's heart hammered. "The land Pike now owns?" "The land Pike claims to own." Caleb stood, dusting off his hands. Possession and legal ownership aren't always the same thing. That night, Eleanor lay awake listening to the sounds of the boarding house creaking timbers, snoring miners, the distant yip of coyotes. Beneath it all, she imagined she could hear water moving through hidden channels, seeking its natural course. Tomorrow, she decided, she'd visit the land office. Tonight, she'd plan. And somewhere in the darkness, she sensed Caleb Rourke was doing the same. Two unlikely allies bound by water rights and the promise of justice in a thirsty land. The moon rose over San Dismas, painting the desert silver. And in the cellar of Hetty's boarding house, water continued its patient work, drop by drop reclaiming what had always been its own. The morning mist clung to the desert floor like secrets waiting to be discovered. Eleanor followed Sammy May through the maze of arroyos and sage, her boots finding purchase on stones worn smooth by floods that came once a year, if at all. The boy moved with the confidence of someone who'd made the outskirts of San Dismas his personal kingdom.
Just through here, Mrs. Nora,
he whispered, though they were half a mile from any ears that might overhear.
Found it yesterday when I was tracking rabbits.
They crested a small rise, and Eleanor's breath caught. Below lay a shallow depression, perhaps 50 yards across, bisected by what had once been an irrigation channel. The old acequia was mostly filled with sand and debris now, but its path was unmistakable, a scar across the landscape that spoke of water's ancient passage.
Look there.
Sammy pointed to fresh boot prints leading along the channel's edge.
Weren't there day before yesterday?
Eleanor knelt beside the prints, noting their size and depth. Heavy men, at least 3 of them, walking with purpose. She followed their trail with her eyes until it disappeared behind a cluster of creosote bushes.
Sammy, I want you to...
Going somewhere, Mrs. Bell. Eleanor's heart lurched. Caleb Rourke stood 10 feet away, having appeared as silently as morning shadow. His hand rested easy on his gun belt, but his eyes were alert, scanning the horizon. Mr. Rourke, you have a talent for unexpected arrivals.
And you have a talent for finding trouble.
He moved closer, his gaze taking in the tracks, the old channel, the way Sammy had positioned himself protectively near Eleanor. This is the old acequia that fed the Delgado Grant. The what? Original Spanish land grant, before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. All this belonged to the Delgado family. They built this channel to bring water from the mountains. He gestured toward the blue shadows of the Sangre de Cristos. When the Americans came, the Delgados couldn't prove ownership the way the new government wanted. Land got broken up, sold off piece by piece. Eleanor processed this information. And the water rights should have stayed with the land, but paper has a way of getting lost, especially when there's profit in the losing. Sammy had wandered ahead, following the boot tracks. Suddenly, he called out, "There's something here." They found him standing over a section where the channel had been recently excavated. Fresh tool marks scarred the old stones, and wooden stakes had been driven into the ground at regular intervals. Red surveyors' flags fluttered from several stakes. "They're mapping it," Eleanor murmured.
But why if Pike already owns the land?
Maybe he doesn't. Caleb knelt beside the excavation.
Or maybe he's not sure he does. Look here.
He brushed sand away from a flat stone embedded in the channel wall. Carved into its surface were worn symbols and what might have been numbers. Eleanor traced the markings with her finger. Spanish. Older, this whole system was built on top of what the Pueblo people made centuries before. The Spanish just improved it. He stood, dusting off his hands. If someone could prove continuous use, prior claim. A glint of metal caught Eleanor's eye. Wedged between 2 stones was a brass button, military by its design. She pocketed it quickly, but not before Caleb noticed. "We should go," he said. "This place has eyes." They were halfway back to town when the riders appeared, 4 men spreading out to cut off their retreat. Eleanor recognized Blackjack Doyle immediately, his scarred face split by an unpleasant grin. Well, the old bride, the drifter, and the orphan brat. Regular scouting party. Caleb stepped forward, putting himself between Eleanor and the riders. "Morning, Doyle. Pleasant day for a ride. Pike doesn't like trespassers. We're on public land." "Are you?" Doyle's grin widened. Funny thing about boundaries. They shift. Man could get confused, wander where he shouldn't. One of the riders had maneuvered closer to Sammy. Eleanor moved instinctively, pulling the boy against her side. The rider laughed. "Protective. Ain't she like a mother hen?" "That's close enough." Caleb's voice carried a new edge, sharp as winter wind. The laughter died. Eleanor felt the tension ratchet up, saw hands drift toward weapons. Her mouth went dry. "Mr. Doyle!" She was surprised by how steady her voice sounded. I'm new to San Dismas, still learning my way. If we've inadvertently crossed onto Mr. Pike's property, we apologize." Doyle studied her. Inadvertently, that's a fancy word. I was a teacher. Fancy words were my stock in trade. Were they now? He leaned forward in his saddle. Tell you what, schoolmarm, you stick to your kitchen and we'll forget this morning's geography lesson. But next time, he let the threat hang. Caleb's hand hadn't moved, but Eleanor sensed the coiled readiness in him, like a spring wound too tight. She touched his arm lightly, a warning, a plea. "We understand," she said. "Good day, gentlemen." The ride back to town was silent, except for the crunch of gravel and Sammy's occasional sniffle. Only when they reached the safety of the main street did Caleb speak. "That was dangerous, what you did." "Which part?" "The part where you made yourself a target. Doyle doesn't forget." Eleanor stopped walking. "Mr. Rourke, I've buried 2 children and a husband. I've survived typhoid, a house fire, and 20 Minnesota winters. I'm not about to be frightened off by a bully with a brass button collection." She produced the button from her pocket. Caleb examined it, his expression darkening. 7th Cavalry, that's from an army uniform. Recent? Very. The style changed just last year. He handed it back. Someone in uniform has been digging around that acequia. They parted at the boarding house, Caleb to whatever business occupied mysterious cowboys, Eleanor to her kitchen duties, but as she kneaded bread for the evening meal, her mind worked over the morning's discoveries like flour through her fingers. Sheriff McKendry appeared just as she was pulling loaves from the oven. "Smells like heaven in here." "Sheriff, coffee, if you're offering." He settled at the kitchen table, looking older than his years. "Heard you had a run-in with Doyle this morning." News traveled fast in San Dismas. "A misunderstanding. We were walking and got turned around." "Uh-huh." He sipped his coffee. "Mrs. Bell, you seem like a sensible woman. So let me be plain. Ephraim Pike owns half this town and has his eye on the other half, the water situation being what it is. Whoever controls the flow controls everything. And Pike controls the water. Most of it. But there's old claims, Spanish grants, Indian treaties paper that could upset his monopoly if it surfaced. Man gets nervous about paper." Eleanor kept her expression neutral. "I'm just a cook. Sheriff." "Are you?" He set down his cup. "Because from where I sit, you look like a woman asking questions. Questions about land and water and who owns what." He stood, settling his hat. "Be careful. Mrs. Bell, Pike plays for keeps, and he's got the whole deck marked." After he left, Eleanor found herself staring at the brass button. 7th Cavalry. What was the military's interest in an old irrigation channel? The dinner crowd was thinner than usual, word of the morning's confrontation had spread. And some boarders were giving her a wide berth, but Horace Greeley lingered after his meal. Mrs. Bell might have a word. She sat across from him. "Of course. Been mining these hills for 15 years. Seen a lot of claims jumped. A lot of good men pushed out." He lowered his voice. "That land Kincaid sold back to Pike, my partner and I had a shaft near there. Back in 72. Good ore, plenty of it, but we couldn't work it." "Why not?" "No water for processing. Nearest source was on that parcel, but the owner, then old Mexican fellow named Delgado, he wouldn't sell. Said the water was promised to the land. Part of some old agreement." Horace leaned closer. 3 months later, Delgado was dead. Horse accident. They said his heir sold out quick, and the new owner shut down water access. My partner and I had to abandon the claim." "Who was the new owner?" "Man named Josiah Pike, Ephraim's father." Eleanor felt pieces clicking together. "So the Pikes have been assembling water rights for years." "Like a chess game, ma'am. And now Ephraim's close to controlling every drop from here to the mountains." Horace stood,
Just thought you should know what kind of game you're walking into.
That night, Eleanor sat by her window, watching shadows move across the desert. Somewhere out there, the old acequia waited, holding secrets in its stones. Below, on the street, she glimpsed Caleb making his evening rounds, checking horses, scanning roof lines, a guardian's ritual. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up. For a moment, they regarded each other across the distance. Then he touched his hat brim and moved on. Eleanor fingered the cavalry button. Tomorrow, she decided, she'd wire an old friend in Santa Fe, someone who might know why the military was interested in San Dismas water rights. Tonight, though, she'd plan her next move carefully. In the cellar below, water continued its patient seepage, and somewhere in his fortress-like home, Ephraim Pike no doubt planned as well, moving pieces on a board only he could fully see. But Eleanor Bell had played her own games of survival, and in this one, she was learning. Water was king, paper was power, and secrets carved in stone might yet flow again. The whispers started with the morning coffee and grew louder with each passing hour. By noon, Eleanor couldn't walk through the dining room without hearing the words trailing behind her like dust devils. Shameless at her age. Throwing herself at that drifter. No wonder Kincaid ran. Hetty Burns stirred the pot with relish, her voice carrying from the parlor. I saw them together at dawn, heading into the desert. A woman of her years should know better than to chase after cowboys young enough to what, Mrs. Burns? Eleanor stood in the doorway. A tray of fresh bread balanced in her hands. The parlor fell silent. Hetty's smile was sharp as a skinning knife. Why, I only meant that people will talk Mrs. Bell. A widow should guard her reputation. Indeed. Eleanor set the bread on the sideboard with deliberate calm. Just as a boarding house owner should guard against spreading lies that could ruin her business. After all, who wants to stay where the proprietress gossips about guests? Color crept up Hetty's neck, but before she could respond, the door burst open. Sammy May rushed in, eyes wide with excitement. Mrs. Nora, there's a meeting at the courthouse, Mr. Pike's calling for a water vote. The courthouse was packed tighter than a cattle car. Eleanor squeezed in beside Rosita, who greeted her with a worried frown. This is bad. Rosita whispered, Pike's proposing a water tax. Every household, every business, paying for what little water they use. At the front of the room, Ephraim Pike commanded attention. He was a large man, soft in the way of those who let others do their hard work, with pale eyes that missed nothing and valued less. Gentlemen, he began, though Eleanor counted at least a dozen women in the crowd. San Dismas faces a crisis. Our wells run low. The river's down to a trickle. Water must be managed responsibly. Managed into your pockets, you mean? Someone shouted from the back. Pike's smile never wavered. I've invested considerably in water infrastructure. Pipes, wells, storage tanks. It's only fair that those who benefit contribute to the maintenance. How much? Called Horace Greeley. $2 per household per month, $5 for businesses. The room erupted. For many, that represented a significant portion of their income. Eleanor watched Sheriff McKendry, noting how he stood slightly behind Pike, his face carefully neutral. Furthermore, Pike continued over the noise, to ensure fair distribution, all private wells must be registered. Unregistered water collection will be discouraged. You mean shut down? This from a farmer Eleanor recognized from the Saturday market? I mean, regulated. Pike's voice hardened. Unless folks prefer to go back to hauling water from the river, what's left of it. What about the old acequia rights? The question came from an elderly Hispanic man near the front. My family's papers. Papers from the Mexican government hold no legal weight. Pike interrupted. This is America. American law prevails. Eleanor felt Caleb's presence before she saw him. A shift in the crowd's energy as he entered. He took position near the door, watchful and still. The meeting deteriorated from there. Voices raised, fists shook, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Pike had the votes he needed from property owners who owed him money or favors. The water tax passed. As people filed out, defeated and angry, Eleanor noticed Blackjack Doyle and 3 men following the elderly Hispanic man who'd asked about acequia rights. She caught Caleb's eye and nodded toward them. He was already moving. That night, the boarding house felt like a powder keg. Miners muttered over their whiskey, and even Hetty seemed subdued. Eleanor was cleaning the kitchen when rocks shattered the window.
Whore!
Water thief. Get out of our town. Glass scattered across the floor. Eleanor stood frozen for a heartbeat. Then heard boots on the porch. Caleb shouldered through the door, gun drawn. "Stay down," he ordered. But Eleanor was already reaching for the broom. "They're just angry about the vote," she said, though her hands shook. "Blaming the outsider." More rocks hit the walls. Caleb moved to the window, careful to stay out of direct view. "This isn't about the vote." "Then what?" "Doyle's been spreading stories. Says you're working with me to grab water rights. Says we're planning to sell out to Eastern investors." Eleanor laughed, short and bitter. "With what I can barely afford to eat." Truth never stopped a good lie. He turned from the window. "Pack light. You're not safe here tonight." "I'm not running." "Not running, relocating." His tone brooked no argument. "Rosita has a room. We'll move you after full dark." Before Eleanor could protest further, Sheriff McKendry appeared, looking harried. "Break it up," he shouted at the crowd outside. "Go on home. All of you." The rocks stopped, but angry voices continued. McKendry entered the kitchen, taking in the broken glass and Eleanor's pale face. "Mrs. Bell, I warned you about asking questions." "I haven't." "You were seen at the old acequia. You've been talking to miners about water rights. Now there's talk you're conspiring to bring in outside money, buy up land." He removed his hat, ran a hand through thinning hair. "I can't protect you if you keep stirring the pot." "Protect me," Eleanor's temper finally snapped. "Where was protection when Mr. Kincaid humiliated me publicly, when Doyle threatened a child, when Pike just legalized theft?" "That's enough." McKendry's face flushed. "You don't understand how things work here." "I understand perfectly." Eleanor advanced on him. "You're bought and paid for. Pike owns you just like he owns the water." McKendry went very still. "Careful, ma'am. Or what you'll run me out of town. Your employer is already working on that." For a moment, something flickered in the sheriff's eyes. Shame, perhaps, or old anger. Then he set his hat back on his head. "Be gone by morning, Mrs. Bell, for your own good." After he left, Caleb touched Eleanor's arm. "You shouldn't have said that. Someone needed to—" But the adrenaline was fading, leaving her tired and heartsick. They waited until midnight to move. Eleanor packed her few belongings while Caleb kept watch. As they slipped out the back door, she heard Hetty's voice from the parlor, holding court with the remaining boarders. "I knew she was trouble the moment I laid eyes on her. Women like that, past their prime, they get desperate, start chasing after any man who'll have them." Eleanor's cheeks burned, but she kept walking. The streets were empty save for a drunk sleeping in a doorway and cats hunting in the shadows. They'd almost reached Rosita's when footsteps echoed behind them. Caleb pushed Eleanor into an alley, hand on his gun. But the figure that emerged from the darkness was unexpected Hetty's nephew, a slight young man who helped with the books. "Mrs. Bell, I'm sorry, I know it's late, but—" He glanced nervously around. "I heard what my aunt said. It's not right. You've been nothing but kind, and she's—" He thrust a bundle at Eleanor. "Your wages. Plus what that Kincaid fellow left to settle his bill. Figured you should have it before you go. Eleanor accepted the bundle, touched by the gesture. Thank you, Mr. Timothy Burns. He shuffled his feet. My aunt, she's not a bad woman, just scared. Pike holds the note on the boarding house. If she doesn't dance to his tune... I understand, Eleanor said gently. Timothy nodded and melted back into the darkness. Caleb waited until his footsteps faded before speaking. That took courage. Yes, Eleanor hefted the bundle. And it changes things. I'm not leaving San Dismas. Nora. No. She faced him in the moonlight. They want me to run because I'm getting close to something. The acequia, the cavalry button, the old man's question about papers, it's all connected. You can't fight Pike alone. I'm not alone. She looked at him steadily. Am I? For a long moment. Caleb studied her face. Then he smiled, quick and wolfish. No, ma'am, you're not. They reached Rosita's without further incident. Over strong coffee and whispered conversation, plans were made. Rosita would reach out to the Hispanic families who might have old documents. Eleanor would use her unexpected wages to make a trip to the territorial capital, researching land records. And Caleb. I'll keep Doyle busy, he said simply. Eleanor didn't ask how. Some things were better left unspecified. As dawn painted the mountains pink, Eleanor stood at Rosita's window, watching the town wake. Smoke rose from chimneys. Dogs barked. Life continued despite the previous night's violence. In the distance, Pike's big house dominated the hillside, water tanks gleaming like armor in the new light. You really think you can beat him? Rosita asked, joining her at the window. Eleanor touched the glass where a crack ran corner to corner, splitting the view of Pike's domain. Water always finds a way, she said, even through stone. Behind them, Caleb cleaned his gun with methodical precision. The sound was oddly comforting, a promise that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. The old bride San Dismas had rejected was gone. In her place stood something harder and more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Let them whisper. Let them gossip about the aging widow and the mysterious cowboy. Eleanor Bell had survived worse than wagging tongues. And Ephraim Pike was about to learn that controlling water was one thing, but controlling the truth was another matter entirely. The town fair should have been a celebration. Colorful bunting stretched between buildings, and the smell of roasted corn mixed with dust and leather. But Eleanor felt the weight of eyes following her as she moved through the crowd, whispers trailing like smoke from a dying fire. There she is, someone muttered. The one causing all the trouble? Eleanor kept her chin high, focusing on the reason she'd come. The document from Santa Fe was tucked safely in her bodice, proof that the old acequia rights were still legally binding. Despite Pike's claims, she needed to find Judge Thornton, the circuit judge who'd arrived for the fair. Instead, she found herself surrounded. Well, if it isn't our famous widow, Blackjack Doyle's voice cut through the festival noise, enjoying yourself. 3 of Pike's men flanked him, creating a wall of hostile flesh. The crowd, sensing entertainment, began to gather. Mr. Doyle. Eleanor kept her voice steady. I'm simply attending the fair like everyone else. Are you now? Doyle stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the tobacco and whiskey on his breath. Funny thing about women who don't know their place. They tend to make spectacles of themselves. He reached out as if to touch her face. Eleanor stepped back, only to find another man behind her. The circle was closing. Gentlemen, she said, loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. I'll ask you to let me pass. Ask all you want. Doyle's grin was predatory. Maybe if you asked prettier, like a woman your age should, get on your knees and beg proper... The crowd laughed, some nervous, some eager. Eleanor's heart hammered but she held Doyle's gaze.
I kneel for no man.
That's your problem right there. He nodded to his men. Boys, I think Mrs. Bell needs a lesson in manners. What happened next occurred so fast, Eleanor barely registered the movement. One moment, Doyle was reaching for her arm. The next, he was on the ground, Caleb Rourke's boot on his wrist. The lady said no. Caleb's voice was quiet, conversational almost, but his hand rested on his gun. I'd listen if I were you. Doyle's face purpled.
You're making a mistake, Drifter.
Wouldn't be my first. Caleb stepped back, allowing Doyle to rise. But touching Mrs. Bell, that would be yours. The crowd held its breath. Eleanor counted heartbeats, waiting for violence to erupt. Then, from the edge of the gathering, Pike's voice rang out. Gentlemen, please, this is a day of celebration. He moved through the crowd like Moses parting the sea, his pale eyes taking in the scene. Mr. Doyle, I believe you have duties elsewhere. Doyle hesitated, then spat in the dust near Eleanor's feet. This ain't over. As Pike's men dispersed, the crowd began to drift away, disappointed at the lack of bloodshed. Pike himself lingered, studying Eleanor with an expression she couldn't read. Hey, Mrs. Bell, you do have a talent for finding yourself at the center of disturbances. I was simply walking, Mr. Pike. Were you? He smiled, cold as winter moonlight. A word of advice at your age. A woman should seek quiet comforts, not public confrontations. The desert can be unforgiving to those who don't know their limits. He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Eleanor shaking with delayed reaction. Caleb's hand touched her elbow, steadying her. We need to move, he said quietly. Too many eyes here. He guided her through the fair, past the pie-eating contest and the horse auction, to the relative quiet near the old mission ruins. The ancient adobe walls provided shelter from both sun and stairs. Thank you, Eleanor managed once she'd caught her breath. Don't thank me yet. Pike's making his move, using Doyle to test boundaries. Caleb scanned their surroundings, always watchful. What were you doing at the fair anyway? Eleanor pulled the document from her bodice. Judge Thornton, I have proof the Asequia rights supersede Pike's claims, but I need... Eleanor Bell. They turned to find a distinguished older man in a black suit, his face weathered but kind. Judge Thornton, she realized with relief. Judge, I'm so glad to find you. I have documents regarding E. Not here, he interrupted, glancing around. Too public. Meet me at the old mission at sunset. Come alone. He paused, considering Caleb. Well, mostly alone. Mr. Rourke's presence might actually be advisable, given the circumstances. After the judge left, Eleanor and Caleb found themselves truly alone among the ruins. The sounds of the fair seemed distant, filtered through centuries of adobe and prayer. You didn't have to intervene, Eleanor said finally. I was handling it. You were about to be handling a lot more than you bargained for. His voice roughened. Doyle doesn't make idle threats. I'm not afraid of... You should be. He turned to face her fully. You think your age protects you, makes you invisible. Pike sees you clear enough, sees you're dangerous. Dangerous? Eleanor laughed, short and bitter. A 46-year-old widow with gray hair and aching joints. A woman with courage and nothing to lose. His eyes held hers. That's the most dangerous kind. Something shifted in the air between them. Eleanor became acutely aware of their isolation, of the way the afternoon light caught the planes of his face. Why do you care? She asked softly. Why risk Pike's anger for someone you barely know? Caleb was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he removed his hat, running his hand through dark hair threaded with silver. You remind me of someone who stood up when it would have been easier to stay silent. She paid for it. His jaw tightened. I wasn't there to help her, But I'm here now. Eleanor's throat constricted. Your wife. My sister. Pike's father destroyed her husband over water rights 15 years ago. She fought back, tried to expose the corruption. He replaced his hat. They found her at the bottom of Soledad Canyon. Said she slipped. But you don't believe that. I know she didn't. His voice was stone. Just like I know Pike won't stop until he owns every drop of water from here to the mountains. Eleanor touched his arm. I'm sorry. He covered her hand with his. Don't be sorry. Be careful. For a moment they stood like that, connected by loss and purpose. Then Caleb stepped back, the moment breaking. We should go. Sun's getting low. But as they turned to leave, Eleanor caught movement near the mission entrance. Sheriff McKendry stood there, his expression unreadable. Sheriff, Eleanor said carefully. Mrs. Bell. Rourke. He approached slowly. Heard there was trouble at the fair. Nothing that wasn't handled, Caleb replied. McKendry studied them both. You know, there was a time when I'd have stopped it before it started, when the law meant something more than the highest bidder. He seemed to age before their eyes. My wife died 3 years ago. Cancer. Pike paid for treatments the doc said might help. They didn't, but the debt remained. Eleanor saw the weight he carried, the compromise that bent his spine. Sheriff, that old mission, he interrupted, gazing at the ruins. Used to hold weddings there, back when the town was young. Couples would come from miles around, believing marriages blessed in its shadow would last forever. His eyes found Eleanor. Foolish superstition. Maybe, but sometimes faith in something, even something impossible, is all we have. He touched his hat brim and walked away, leaving Eleanor puzzled by the encounter. But as the sun began its descent, painting the adobe walls gold, understanding dawned. He was warning us, she breathed. The judge, it's a trap. Caleb was already moving. The mission, Pike's men will be waiting. They circled wide, approaching the ruins from the desert side as shadows lengthened. Sure enough, Eleanor spotted figures positioned at the main entrance and among the fallen walls. No judge in sight. We need to warn, Eleanor began, but Caleb pulled her down behind a cluster of sage. Too late. Look! Judge Thornton was being escorted from the mission by 2 of Pike's men. He didn't appear hurt, but his face was grim. As they passed close to Eleanor and Caleb's hiding spot, she heard him say, You tell Pike this won't stand, intimidating a territorial judge. Ain't intimidation. Judge. One of the men replied, Just explaining how things work in San Dismas. You'll make the right decisions. After they left, Eleanor and Caleb remained hidden until full dark. The fair sounds had died away, replaced by the desert's night music coyotes, wind, the whisper of sand against stone. We can't trust the law, Eleanor said finally. Never could. Caleb helped her to her feet. But that doesn't mean we stop fighting. As they made their way back toward town, Eleanor felt the weight of the day settling on her shoulders. She'd been publicly humiliated, threatened, and nearly trapped, but she was still standing. Caleb, she said as they reached the edge of town, what you said earlier, about me being dangerous. He paused, silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Yes, you were right. She squared her shoulders. I am dangerous, because I have absolutely nothing left to lose and everything to prove. And tomorrow, Pike's going to learn just how dangerous a woman my age can be. He studied her in the moonlight, this silver-haired warrior in a patched dress. Then, so quickly she almost missed it in the darkness. He smiled. That's my girl, he said softly. The words hung between them, unexpected and warm as a desert spring. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, grateful for the darkness that hid her reaction. I'm hardly a girl, she managed. No, he agreed, moving closer. You're so much more than that. For a heartbeat, Eleanor thought he might kiss her. The moment stretched, fragile as spun glass. Then a door slammed somewhere, breaking the spell, and they stepped apart. "I should see you safely to Rosita's," Caleb said, his voice carefully neutral. Eleanor nodded, not trusting her own voice. As they walked through the quiet streets, she replayed his words. "That's my girl." Such a simple phrase, yet it had made her feel something she'd thought dead and buried with her youth. Hope. And for a woman who'd been dismissed as too old, too used up, too far past her prime, hope was the most dangerous weapon of all. The morning sun had barely cleared the mountains when Eleanor stood before the assembled crowd in the dusty town square. Word had spread like wildfire the old bride was calling a public meeting about water rights. Some came to gawk, others out of genuine interest, but Eleanor counted at least 50 souls gathered in the early heat. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her teacher's voice carrying clearly. "I stand before you with proof that Ephraim Pike's water monopoly is built on lies and stolen documents." She held up the papers from Santa Fe, letting the morning light catch the official seals. "These territorial records show that the Acequia rights, the ancient water rights, still legally belong to the original land grants. Pike's claims are invalid." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Eleanor spotted Rosita nodding encouragement, while Horace Greeley and several other miners pressed closer to hear. Even Timothy Burns had come, standing nervously at the edge of the gathering. "Furthermore," Eleanor continued, "I have evidence that Pike has been diverting water from its lawful course, storing it in hidden." The sharp crack of rifle fire split the air. People screamed, scattering like quail. Eleanor stood frozen as smoke began billowing from the direction of the granary, not just any granary, but the one belonging to Miguel Herrera, who'd been most vocal in supporting her research into the old water rights. "Fire, the granary's on fire!" The crowd dissolved into chaos. Men ran for buckets, women herded children to safety. Eleanor found herself swept along in the confusion until strong hands gripped her arms. "This way," Caleb commanded, pulling her against the current of panicking townsfolk. "It's a diversion. Pike's making his real move elsewhere." They cut through alleys and behind buildings, Caleb moving with purpose. The smell of smoke grew stronger, and Eleanor could hear the crackle of flames consuming months of stored grain. "Where are we going?" she gasped. "The old warehouse. If I'm right." He stopped abruptly, pulling her into a doorway. There, down the street, Blackjack Doyle and 3 men were loading wooden crates onto a wagon. Even from this distance, Eleanor could see the urgency in their movements. "Evidence," Caleb murmured. "They're moving whatever they've been hiding. We have to stop them." "Not directly, too many guns." He scanned the area. "But if we can track where they're taking it." A child's scream cut through the air. Eleanor's blood froze. She knew that voice. "Sammy." Before Caleb could stop her, she was running toward the burning granary. The boy's cries came from inside, high and terrified. Smoke poured from the building's windows, and flames licked at the roof. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She pulled her shawl over her nose and mouth and plunged through the doorway. The heat hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. Smoke burned her eyes, turning the familiar space into a hellish maze. "Sammy, where are you?" "Mrs. Nora!" His voice came from the left, near the grain bins. "I can't get out, the beam fell." Eleanor dropped to her hands and knees. Crawling below the worst of the smoke, she found him trapped beneath a fallen support beam, his leg bent at an awkward angle. The fire was spreading faster now, eating through the dry wood with terrifying appetite. "Hold still," she ordered, putting her shoulder under the beam. It was heavier than anything she'd ever lifted, but desperation gave her strength. The wood groaned and shifted, just enough for Sammy to scramble free. "Can you walk?" "I think—" He tried to stand and cried out. Without hesitation, Eleanor scooped him into her arms. He was heavier than he looked, all knees and elbows, but she'd carried heavier burdens. The smoke was thicker now, the heat unbearable. She couldn't see the door, couldn't tell which way led to safety. Then Caleb was there, materializing from the smoke like an avenging angel. Without a word, he took Sammy from her arms and grabbed her hand, leading them through the inferno with unerring instinct. They burst into daylight just as part of the roof collapsed behind them. Eleanor fell to her knees, coughing and gasping. Her hands were burned, her dress singed. But Sammy was safe. Rosita appeared immediately, checking the boy's leg with professional efficiency.
Bruised, not broken, she announced. You're lucky, Nino. Lucky misses. Nora came for me,
Sammy corrected, looking at Eleanor with hero worship. The bucket brigade had formed, but it was clearly too late for the granary. Miguel Herrera stood watching his livelihood burn, his face a mask of despair. 6 months of grain, he said hollowly. My family's whole harvest. Eleanor struggled to her feet, anger burning hotter than her injured hands. This wasn't an accident.
Prove it.
Sheriff McKendry had arrived, looking harried. Fires happen, old wood, dry conditions.
And Doyle just happened to be moving Pike's hidden cargo at the same time.
Caleb's voice cut like a blade. McKendry's face tightened.
You saw this.
We both did, Eleanor confirmed. Whatever was in that warehouse, they didn't want it found. The sheriff looked between them, then at the burning building. And Eleanor saw the moment his conscience finally won its long battle with his compromised position. The old mine road, he said quietly. If they're moving contraband, that's where they'll go. But you didn't hear it from me. He walked away before they could respond, shoulders bent under invisible weight. The pursuit that followed tested every ounce of Eleanor's remaining strength. Caleb had commandeered horses she didn't ask how, and they rode hard into the desert, following dust clouds and wagon tracks. The sun climbed higher, turning the landscape into a shimmering furnace. They caught up to the wagon in a narrow canyon, where centuries of flash floods had carved the rock into fantastic shapes. Doyle and his men had stopped to rest the horses, confident they hadn't been followed. Stay here, Caleb ordered, dismounting with fluid grace. Not a chance, Eleanor shot back, though every muscle screamed protest. What followed was a dance of violence and desperation. Caleb moved like smoke, using the rocks for cover, drawing the men away from the wagon. Eleanor heard gunshots, shouts, the thunder of hooves as horses scattered. She crept toward the wagon, needing to know what Pike had been so desperate to hide. The crates were nailed shut, but someone had left a crowbar. She pried at the nearest lid, wood splintering under her assault. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were stacks of documents, maps, surveys, contracts, and at the bottom, a leather journal that made her hands shake as she opened it. It was all there, records of diverted water, of wells capped and streams rerouted, names of families driven off their land, their water rights mysteriously vanishing from territorial records.
And dates, so many dates, going back 20 years. Fascinating reading.
Eleanor spun to find Doyle behind her, his face twisted with fury. Blood ran from a gash on his forehead, and his gun hands shook slightly, but the barrel pointed straight at her heart. You should have taken the hint and left town, he snarled. Old women who don't know their place tend to have accidents. Like Joshua Pike had an accident 15 years ago. Eleanor held up the journal. It's all here. Doyle. Every crime, every theft. Even how you pushed Maria Rourke off that cliff when she got too close to the truth. His face went white. You don't know. The shot came from behind, spinning Doyle around. He fell against the wagon wheel, gun tumbling from nerveless fingers. Caleb stood 20 feet away, smoke still rising from his pistol, his face carved from stone. That was for Maria, he said quietly. Doyle struggled to speak, blood frothing on his lips. Pike will... Pike will hang. Eleanor finished.
This journal guarantees it.
Sheriff McKendry and a posse arrived as the sun began its western descent, drawn by the gunfire. He took in the scene Doyle's body, the opened crates, Eleanor clutching the journal like a lifeline. Self-defense, he pronounced after hearing their account. Clear as day. And these documents, he whistled low. This changes everything. The ride back to San Dismas felt both endless and too short. Eleanor swayed in the saddle, exhaustion and lingering smoke inhalation making her lightheaded. Caleb rode close, ready to catch her if she fell. As they entered town, word spread quickly. People emerged from buildings, following their progress like a growing river. By the time they reached the jail, half the town had assembled. Pike was there, still in his expensive suit, trying to maintain his air of authority. But Eleanor saw the cracks, the sweat on his brow, the way his hands clenched and unclenched. "Sheriff," he began, "surely you're not going to believe the ravings of a desperate woman and a known—" "Ephraim Pike," McKendry interrupted, his voice steady for the first time in years. "You're under arrest for theft, fraud, and conspiracy. Maybe murder, too. Once we sort through all this—" The crowd erupted. Some cheered. Others stood in shocked silence. Eleanor watched Pike's empire crumble in real time, his supporters melting away like snow in the desert. "You'll pay for this," Pike hissed as McKendry cuffed him. "Both of you. I have friends. Influence." "You have nothing," Eleanor said quietly. "Just like all the families you robbed had nothing. How does it feel?" As Pike was led away, the crowd's attention turned to Eleanor and Caleb. Someone started clapping Miguel Herrera. Despite his loss, others joined in, the sound building until it filled the square. Eleanor swayed on her feet, and Caleb's arm came around her waist, solid and sure.
"You did it,"
he murmured against her ear. "We did it," she corrected, leaning into his strength. The sun set behind them, painting the desert red as blood and gold as hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, trials, rebuilding, the slow work of undoing 20 years of corruption. But tonight, in this moment, an old bride had brought down an empire, and the cowboy at her side looked at her like she was everything the town had said she wasn't: beautiful, valuable, worth fighting for. "Come on," Caleb said softly. "Let's get those burns looked at. Heroes need to be in fighting shape for tomorrow." Eleanor laughed, surprising herself. "Heroes? I'm just a 46-year-old cook who asks too many questions." "No," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're the bravest woman I've ever known. And if this town can't see that, they're bigger fools than I thought." As they walked toward Rosita's, surrounded by grateful townspeople, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in years, not just hope or vindication, but the stirring of something deeper, something that had nothing to do with water rights or justice, and everything to do with the man beside her who saw her not as too old, but as exactly right. The circuit judge arrived on a Tuesday, bringing with him the weight of territorial law and the promise of justice. The courtroom, hastily arranged in the town hall, overflowed with citizens eager to witness Ephraim Pike's downfall. Eleanor sat in the front row, the recovered documents spread before her on the prosecutor's table, her bandaged hands a testament to the price of truth. The court recognizes the ancient water rights as documented in these territorial records, Judge Harrison pronounced after 3 days of testimony. "All diversions and private claims made by Mr. Pike are hereby nullified. The acequia system shall be restored to community management." The gavel fell like thunder. Pike, shackled and diminished, was led away to await transport to the territorial prison. But it was the aftermath that truly mattered, the slow, careful work of rebuilding what greed had destroyed. Eleanor stood at the old acequia, watching Caleb direct a crew of volunteers in clearing years of deliberate obstruction. The channel had been filled with rocks and debris, but water has memory, and it wanted to flow along its ancient path. Easy with that stone, Caleb called to one of the workers. These walls were built to last centuries. Let's not undo that in a day. Sammy May, his legs still wrapped but healing, sat nearby sketching the work in a notebook Eleanor had given him. The boy had become her shadow since the fire, arriving each morning to help with whatever tasks his injury allowed. "I'm Mrs. Nora," he said, looking up from his drawing. "When the water comes back, will things be like they were before?" "No," Eleanor said gently. "They'll be better, because now we know what we're protecting." Horace Greeley approached. Hat in hand, "Mrs. Bell, the town councils met. We want to offer you a position water rights administrator, official-like, with proper pay and everything." Eleanor blinked in surprise. "Mr. Greeley, I'm honored, but no buts about it. You understand the old systems, got the education to handle the paperwork, and Lord knows you've earned our trust." He grinned. "Besides, can't have you leaving now that we finally got decent cooking in this town again." That evening, Eleanor found herself back at Hetty's boarding house, but this time as an invited guest. The proprietress had asked to speak with her privately, and Eleanor discovered a very different woman than the sharp-tongued gossip of weeks past. "I owe you an apology," Hetty began without preamble. "More than one, truth be told. The things I said, the way I treated you." She stopped, swallowing hard. "Pike held my mortgage. Every cruel word I spoke, every rumor I spread. I did to keep a roof over my head, but that's no excuse." Eleanor studied the older woman's face, seeing the deep lines carved by compromise and regret. "We all made choices to survive, Mrs. Burns. Some choices were harder than others." Hetty reached into her desk, pulling out a wrapped package. "This came on yesterday's stage, addressed to you." Eleanor unwrapped it carefully, gasping at what lay inside. A wooden sign, professionally carved and painted, "Eleanor's Kitchen Fine Dining and Honest Fare." "I thought, if you're staying, you might want to make the arrangement more permanent." Hetty stammered. "Full partnership in the dining room. Your recipes, your rules. I'll stick to running the rooms." "Hey, Mrs. Burns, Hetty, I don't know what to say." "Say yes." Hetty's smile was watery but genuine. "Lord knows this town could use some sweetness after all the bitter we've swallowed." Later that night, Eleanor stood at her window watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Tomorrow, they would open the small dam Caleb's crew had constructed. Tomorrow, water would flow through the old channels again. A knock at her door interrupted her reverie. Caleb stood in the hallway, hat in hand, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "Evening, Nora. I wondered if you might take a walk with me." They strolled through the quiet streets, past the jail where Pike had spent his last night, past the rebuilt granary where the community had pooled resources to replace Miguel Herrera's lost grain, past the school where Eleanor had begun teaching evening classes to adults who'd never learned to read. "You've done something remarkable here," Caleb said as they reached the edge of town. "Brought a community back to life. We did it together, all of us. Maybe, but you lit the match." He stopped walking, turning to face her in the moonlight. "I've been thinking about what comes next. With Pike gone, some folks figure I'll move on." "Nothing keeping me here." Eleanor's heart sank. Of course he would leave. Men like Caleb didn't settle down, especially not with women old enough to be. "But they're wrong," he continued. "There is something keeping me here. Someone—" Eleanor couldn't breathe. "Caleb." "I know what people will say. The age difference. The talk about propriety and what's fitting." He stepped closer. "But I've spent my whole life drifting, looking for something I couldn't name. Then you arrived, and suddenly I knew it was you I was looking for. Not some young thing who'd simper and swoon, but a woman with steel in her spine and fire in her heart.
I'm 46 years old, Eleanor whispered. My hair's gray, my hands are rough. I've buried children. And you're beautiful.
His hand cupped her cheek. Every line on your face tells a story of strength. Every gray hair is a battle won. You think I want some untested girl. I want a woman who's lived, who's loved and lost and chosen to love again. Tears ran down Eleanor's face.
The town can hang themselves with their own tongues for all I care, but I don't think they will. You've earned their respect, Nora. And even if you hadn't, I'd still be standing here, asking you to let me court you proper.
Eleanor laughed through her tears. Court me, mister. Rourke, I'm a bit old for courting. Never too old for romance, he said firmly. Never too old to be cherished like you deserve. So what do you say? Will you let this worn-out cowboy try to win your heart? Instead of answering with words, Eleanor did something the gossips would have said was scandalous. For a woman her age, she kissed him. Not the passionate embrace of youth, but something deeper, richer, seasoned by loss and sweetened by hope. When they finally parted, Caleb was grinning like a boy. I'll take that as a yes. The next morning brought the entire town to the Acequia opening. Sheriff McKendry, badge gleaming with new purpose, organized the crowd. Rosita had prepared traditional foods for the celebration. Even the territorial governor had sent representatives to witness the historic moment. Eleanor stood with the other council members as Father Martinez from the old mission offered a blessing. Then Caleb and his crew lifted the temporary dam. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like the earth sighing in relief, water began to flow. First a trickle, then a stream, then a rushing river of life returning to its rightful course. The crowd erupted in cheers, some people crying openly as they watched the desert drink deeply. Look there. Sammy pointed downstream where the Acequia curved toward town. Green shoots were already visible along the bank seeds that had waited years for water's return, ready to bloom at the first touch of moisture. That evening, the town celebrated as it hadn't in decades. Music filled the square. Couples danced, and children splashed in the shallow pools forming along the Acequia's route. Eleanor supervised the feast from her new kitchen, her sign hanging proudly over the door. Timothy Burns appeared at her elbow. Aunt Hetty wants to know if you need anything else brought out. Tell her we're managing beautifully. Eleanor smiled at the young man who'd shown courage when it mattered. And Timothy, thank you again for what you did that night. It made a difference. He flushed with pleasure and hurried off. Eleanor was checking the cornbread when strong arms encircled her waist from behind. You planning to cook all night? Caleb murmured against her ear.
Someone has to feed all these people.
Someone should also dance with the man who's been waiting all evening for the chance. He turned her in his arms. Come on, Nora. The food will keep, but this moment won't come again. She let him lead her into the square, into the music and laughter and joy of a community reborn. As they moved together, Eleanor caught sight of their reflection in a shop window, the weathered cowboy and the silver-haired woman, no longer young, but somehow perfect together. What are you thinking? Caleb asked.
That Tobias Kincaid was right,
Eleanor said, surprising them both. I am too old to be the bride he wanted, young and pliable and silent. But I'm exactly the right age to be the woman this town needed. And maybe... She looked up at him. The right age for you. His answer was in his eyes, in the way he held her, in the whispered promise that age was just a number and love was timeless. As they danced, water continued its patient work, flowing through ancient channels, bringing life back to the desert. And in the morning, when the sun rose over San Dismas, it would shine on a town transformed not just by water, but by the courage of one woman who refused to accept that she was too old for justice, too old for respect, and definitely too old for love. The territorial newspaper would later write about the water rights miracle of San Dismas, But those who were there knew the real miracle was simpler and more profound, a community, learning that wisdom, courage, and love don't diminish with age. They grow stronger, deeper, flowing like water through the channels carved by time. The evening sun cast long shadows across the desert as Eleanor stood beside the restored Asikia, her silver hair catching the golden light like a crown. 6 months had passed since Pike's arrest, and San Dismas had transformed from a town dying of thirst to one blooming with possibility. "Never thought I'd see water running here again," Caleb said, joining her at the channel's edge. He carried a small bouquet of desert wildflowers, purple lupines and golden poppies that had sprouted along the water's path. Eleanor accepted the flowers with a smile that made her eyes crinkle. The desert was just waiting. It never forgot how to bloom. Speaking of blooming, Caleb cleared his throat, suddenly looking like a schoolboy despite his 35 years. "I have something to ask you." Before he could continue, Sammy May came running, his recovered leg carrying him swift as a road runner. "Mrs. Nora, Mr. Caleb, come quick, there's riders coming, lots of them." They hurried to Main Street, where a crowd was already gathering. Eleanor counted at least a dozen riders approaching from the east, dust clouds marking their passage. Her heart tightened had Pike's associates come for revenge. But as the riders drew closer, she saw they weren't gunmen. They were families' men, women, and children, their wagons loaded with household goods and hope. "Name's Patterson," the lead rider announced, dismounting stiffly. "Heard tell San Dismas has water again and fair administration. We're looking to settle, if you'll have us." Sheriff McKendry stepped forward, his badge bright in the fading light. "San Dismas welcomes all honest folk. Mrs. Bell here can tell you about land allocation and water rights." Eleanor found herself surrounded by eager faces, answering questions about soil quality and irrigation schedules. She caught Caleb's eye across the crowd, and he winked, their private moment postponed by the demands of a growing community. Later that evening, after the new families had been settled at Hetty's boarding house, Eleanor finally returned to her small room. She was surprised to find it transformed. Candles flickered on every surface, and desert roses filled the air with sweet perfume. Caleb stood by the window, silhouetted against the stars. "Rosita helped," he admitted. "Said if I was going to do this, I should do it proper." "Do what?" Eleanor asked, though her heart already knew. He crossed to her, taking her hands in his. The calluses on his palms matched hers working hands. Honest hands. "Eleanor Bell, you came to this town as a mail-order bride, rejected and scorned, but you became something more, our conscience, our courage, our heart. You taught us that water isn't the only thing worth fighting for. Dignity matters, justice matters, love matters." He dropped to one knee, producing a simple silver ring set with a small turquoise stone. "I'm not a rich man. I can't offer you fancy dresses or a mansion on a hill. But I can offer you partnership, respect, and a love that sees you not as too old, but as exactly right. Will you marry me? Nora." Eleanor's vision blurred with tears. "Caleb Rourke, you beautiful, stubborn man. Yes, yes, of course, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger and stood, pulling her into his arms. This time when they kissed, it was with the promise of all their tomorrows, however many they might have. "When?" she asked breathlessly. "Tomorrow, if you'll have me, at the old mission, where McKendry said marriages are blessed to last forever." Eleanor laughed. "The town gossips will have a field day, the old bride and the younger cowboy." "Let them talk," Caleb interrupted. "They'll be too busy eating your wedding cake to complain much." The ceremony took place at sunset the next day. The old mission, partially restored with community effort, glowed in the amber light. It seemed the entire town had come. Even those who'd whispered behind Eleanor's back now smiled with genuine warmth. Rosita stood as Eleanor's witness, tears streaming down her face.
You deserve this, mi amiga. Every happiness.
Sammy May carried the rings, his young face serious with responsibility. Sheriff McKendry, who'd found new purpose in honest service, performed the ceremony with surprising eloquence. "Marriage," he said, "is like water in the desert, precious, life-giving, and worth fighting for. These two have proven they know how to fight for what matters." When Caleb kissed his bride, the cheer that went up could be heard clear to the mountains. Even Hetty Burns dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. The celebration that followed filled the town square. Tables groaned under the weight of food Eleanor had insisted on cooking much of it herself. With help from her growing kitchen staff, musicians played, couples danced, and children ran between the tables like schools of happy fish. "No honeymoon trip?" Rosita asked as she whirled past in the arms of a blushing miner. "We're exactly where we want to be," Eleanor replied, safe in Caleb's embrace. As the night deepened, Timothy Burns approached with a ledger. "Mrs. Mrs. Rourke, the Water Committee, has their first report. Every family has access now, and the cooperative is showing a profit. We can start those school improvements you wanted." Eleanor beamed. Education had always been her first love, and now she could ensure every child in San Dismas had a chance to learn. "That's not all," Sheriff McKendry added, joining them. "That letter you sent to the territorial capital about preserving the acequia system, the governor's creating a commission, and he wants you to head it. Seems your fame has spread." "Eleanor." "Our fame," she corrected, squeezing Caleb's hand. "None of this would have happened without all of us working together." As midnight approached, Caleb led Eleanor away from the celebration to a small adobe house on the edge of town. "Our new home," he said simply. "Built it myself, with help from friends. It's not much." "It's perfect," Eleanor interrupted, taking in the solid walls, the wide porch facing the mountains, the small garden already planted with herbs and flowers. Inside, moonlight streamed through windows that faced the restored acequia. Eleanor could hear water gurgling peacefully, a lullaby of renewal. "No regrets?" Caleb asked, watching her explore their new home. "How could I regret the path that led me to you?" Eleanor turned in his arms. "If Tobias Kincaid had kept his promise, I'd be a proper wife in a proper marriage. Properly miserable, instead. I'm a scandal, the too-old bride who fought the water baron, who kisses cowboys in public, who dares to be happy past her prime." "You're not past anything," Caleb murmured against her hair. "You're just beginning. We're just beginning." Outside, a coyote called to the stars, and the desert answered with its own wild music. Inside, two people who'd found love in the last place they'd expected held each other close. Proof that sometimes the best stories start with rejection and end with redemption. The next morning brought new challenges. Word came that Blackjack Doyle had been spotted 3 towns over, apparently recovered from his wounds and gathering men. But as Eleanor stood on her porch, watching the sun rise over a green valley where desert had been, she felt no fear. San Dismas had faced down one tyrant. They could handle whatever came next. They had water, they had law, and most importantly, they had each other. Sammy May appeared, as he did every morning now, ready for his lessons before school. "Morning. Mrs. Rourke Mr. Caleb said to tell you he's checking the North Acequia with the Patterson boys."
"Thank you, Sammy."
Eleanor ruffled his hair. "Ready to work on your letters?" As the boy settled at her kitchen table, Eleanor caught sight of herself in the mirror. Silver hair neatly pinned, face lined but glowing, wearing a simple dress and an apron already dusted with flour. She looked like what she was, a woman who'd lived fully and wasn't done yet. The morning light caught her wedding ring, making the turquoise glow like captured sky. In the distance, she could see Caleb working, his familiar figure a comfort and a promise. "I'm Mrs. Rourke," Sammy's voice called her back.
"How do you spell justice?"
Eleanor smiled and went to show him. One more lesson in a lifetime of teaching. Outside,
The acequia sang its ancient song, and San Dismas bloomed in the desert like hope made manifest. The town's story would continue, new families arriving, new challenges arising. There would be droughts and floods, conflicts and reconciliations, but the foundation had been laid, built on the simple truth that Caleb had spoken at the mission ruins: courage and love don't diminish with age. They grow stronger, deeper, flowing like water through the channels carved by time. And in the heart of it all, an old bride and her cowboy would face whatever came, together, not because their story was ending, but because at 46 and 35, their greatest adventure was just beginning. The desert had taught them patience, the town had taught them courage, and each other, they'd taught them that love, like water, always finds a way, even when everyone says you're too old for it to matter anymore. Especially then. Thank you so much for listening to this story of love, justice, and new beginnings in the Old West. I hope Eleanor and Caleb's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine. Where are you listening to this tale tonight? Please share in the comments below. I'd love to know if you're cozied up at home, on a long drive, or perhaps even somewhere out in the wide western lands where stories like this once lived and breathed. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Night for more tales of courage and romance from the frontier. Hit that like button if Eleanor's triumph made you smile. And please hit the hype button to help this story reach more listeners who need to hear that it's never too late for love, never too late for justice, and never too late to begin again. Until next time, partners, keep riding toward your own sunset. Happy trails.